Hey guys, tonight we slip into the sandals of Miyamoto Musashi, Japan's most famously scruffy swordsman, philosopher, and arguably cave-dwelling introvert. You're him now, just a scrawny kid with a wild mop of hair and a wooden sword too big for your hands. You're waking up in a one-room house with no glass windows, no breakfast ready, and no indoor plumbing. Welcome to the Sengoku period, a time when warlords fought over everything and childhood basically meant to survive or don't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your futon smells faintly of rice straw and mildew. Sunlight slants in through slatted shutters, lighting up dust motes that float like sleepy spirits. Somewhere outside, a rooster is screaming as if it just realized it's a rooster. You sit up, stretch, and scratch at your neck. You're about 12, maybe 13. No one's quite sure. Birth certificates aren't really a thing right now. Your name is Shinmen Takezo, for now. You live in a village that barely earns a name. The paths are dirt. The buildings, wood and bark. No cobblestones, no tea ceremonies here, just the creaking of wooden wheels and the occasional clanging of blacksmiths. Most people here are farmers or soldiers, or both, depending on whether there's a war this week. You, though, you're different. You've got that look in your eyes. The one that says, I'm probably going to hit someone with a stick before sundown. You weren't raised gently. Your mother died when you were a baby. Your father, a sword master with the warmth of an empty fireplace, taught you with fists and fury. He wasn't one for lullabies. His idea of parenting was making you fight grown men before your voice dropped. One historical account even claims he tried to kill you with a wooden sword once to toughen you up. Sweet guy. Eventually, he either died or disappeared. Records are foggy. And you were left in the care of an uncle, a priest. He tried to steer you toward calligraphy and Buddhism. You, of course, took one look at the peaceful scrolls and decided to use them for target practice. Swordplay was your calling. Everything else felt like background noise. The Japan of your time is fractured, dangerous, and frankly, exhausting. You lived during the tail end of the Sengoku period, also known as the Warring States era, where hundreds of clans constantly scheme, betray, and battle for land and honor. Peace is not a default setting. Even monks carry swords. Farmers train at night. No one's quite sure which daimyo owns which mountain anymore. And you? You just want to fight. You want to feel the rush of steel clashing, the silence before a duel, and maybe, just maybe, become the greatest swordsman who ever lived. Now let's pause for one historical reality check. Most samurai didn't duel for sport. They fought in wars, yes, but they were also bureaucrats, landowners, and professional paper pushers. A lot of them spent more time doing taxes than training with swords. You, though, are built different. You skip the politics, dodge the rice farming, and jump straight into the blade-swinging chaos. And here's a little-known tidbit. At this age, your favorite training weapon is not even a proper katana. It's a bakken, a wooden sword. You treat it like an extension of your arm. You sleep with it. You spar with trees. You once cracked a chicken coop in half because you misjudged your swing. Sorry, chickens. Some scholars argue whether you were naturally gifted or just extremely stubborn. There are stories of you practicing swings for hours until your palms bled. Some say you even tied weights to your ankles to move faster when unburdened. Others think that's a later invention, part of the myth building that turned you from a man into a legend. As you head outside into the dusty morning, you pass by men carrying rice bales and women drawing water from a communal well. Nobody expects much from you yet. You're still just a wiry kid with wild eyes and bad posture. But you already walk like someone who knows where they're going, even if it's nowhere specific. You've got that slow, deliberate stride. The kind that says, don't talk to me unless you're holding a sword. Oh, and speaking of hygiene, let's be honest. Bathing is not a daily habit in your world. People bathe occasionally in public baths, usually when enough people complain. You're used to the smell of sweat, smoke, and damp straw. Somehow it makes you feel alive. You find your practice spot by the edge of the woods, the same patch you've claimed for years. The trees here are scarred from countless strikes. You don't have a master. You learn by doing. Every swing is your teacher. Every bruise is a lecture. You train until your arms tremble and your vision blurs. And still you keep going. Because you're not aiming to be good. You're aiming to be undeniable. By midday, you're covered in dust, soaked in sweat, and grinning like an idiot. The villagers shake their heads. "That Takezo boy," they mutter. "He's going to get himself killed." And maybe you will, but not today. Today, you head back to your shack, gulp down water like it's treasure, and collapse onto your mat with the kind of satisfied exhaustion only a future legend earns before puberty ends. This was the morning of your story. One day people will write books about you, statues will be carved, philosophies will be quoted. But for now, you're just a kid with no shoes, a splintered wooden sword, and a stubborn dream. You don't really feel nervous. That's the strange part. Your heart isn't pounding like the others say it should. You're not sweating out of fear, though that might just be because your body is already used to going unwashed for days at a time. No, what you feel is a kind of low humming heat in your chest, like a small coal sitting there, waiting. The village has gathered, though they pretend they haven't. Eyes peek from behind rice paper doors and through the narrow slats in barn walls. Word spreads fast when a 13-year-old challenges a samurai. It's early morning again. The sky is pale and thick with summer haze. Somewhere nearby, a cicada starts droning like a tiny alarm bell. You're barefoot, holding your bakken, just a heavy stick of wood, really. Your opponent, Arima Kihei, is a professional, a real swordsman, a trained warrior of the Shinto Ryu school. He's traveled here from another province, supposedly to teach and display his art. But let's be honest, he's mostly here to show off and maybe collect a few donations. You challenged him yesterday, loudly, in public, which is very on brand for you. He laughed at first, of course, most grown men would. You're lanky, all elbows and knees, hair like a bird's nest, and you've got this cocky grin that makes people want to hit you just to wipe it off. But something about your challenge stuck. Maybe it was your stare, steady, cold, unblinking. Maybe it was your refusal to flinch when he drew his blade just an inch to test your courage. Or maybe, honestly, he just wanted to shut you up in front of the villagers. Either way, the duel is set. It's happening. Now here's a mainstream historical fact for you. This duel actually happened. You were around 13, maybe a bit younger. Arima Kihei was in his 20s or 30s, depending on the source. He had a real sword. You had a wooden one. No one expected you to win. Most didn't expect you to live. You both step into a patch of beaten earth near the riverbank. There's no ring, no referees, just grass, silence, and the promise of violence. The air is thick and unmoving. Kihei gives a little bow, more out of habit than respect, and draws his blade with a slow, practiced ease. His eyes are scanning, calculating. You, on the other hand, stand like a loose rope. Your bakken dangling at your side, and then it happens. There's no grand signal, no shouted command. Just a twitch in the wrist, a shift in weight, and you move. Fast. Faster than anyone expected. Faster than Kihei, that's for sure. You close the distance in a heartbeat and swing your bakken. With all the force you've been storing in your spine for years, it crashes into his skull with a crack that echoes like thunder through the trees. He drops, just like that. Folded knees, slack jaws, body sprawled in the dust. Blood spills, fast and bright, pooling beneath his cheek. You don't feel triumphant. You don't feel anything. You just stare down at him, blinking, waiting for someone to tell you what to do next. And here's the thing. This was the moment that changed everything. This was when people stopped calling you that wild boy and started calling you something else. Dangerous, gifted, cursed. Take your pick. Let's pause here for a weird historical tidbit. There's a theory that Kihei didn't die immediately. Some accounts suggest he staggered off and succumbed to his wounds days later. Others think you cracked his head so hard it ended right then and there. But what's even weirder is that, despite the very public nature of the fight, no one seems to have punished you for it. Maybe because Kihei was seen as arrogant, maybe because you were so young, Or maybe the villagers just didn't want to get involved. Feudal Japan wasn't big on police reports. After the duel, you disappear into the woods. That's not a metaphor. You literally leave town, vanish into the forest, and don't come back. Some say you were on the run. Others believe you felt disgusted at your own brutality and went seeking penance. But knowing you, you probably just thought, well, I beat a samurai. Time to go find someone stronger. Historians still argue whether this duel was an act of brilliant instinct or raw luck. Some say your timing and strike placement were flawless, evidence of early genius. Others say you got lucky with a wild swing and happened to connect with enough force to end it. But none of that matters to you. You're not thinking about history books. You're just thinking about the next fight. Your feet carry you along a narrow mountain path, through cedar groves and shrines coated in moss. The wind is soft but relentless, tugging at your sleeves like a reminder that nothing stays still. You don't have a map. You don't even have a plan. All you have is your bakken, your hunger, and that coal in your chest, glowing hotter now. At night, you sleep under trees, using your own arm as a pillow. You eat whatever you can steal or catch. Wild onions, river fish, the occasional half-ripe persimmon. You begin to look less like a boy and more like a ghost. Hollow cheeks, sun-darkened skin, eyes too still for someone your age. And still, you train. Every morning, every night, swing after swing after swing. You start to hear stories, too, about schools of swordsmanship, roaming ronin, old warriors teaching in the mountains. You collect these rumors like treasure. Each name you hear is another possible opponent, another test of whether your first duel was a fluke or a prophecy. One night you sit by a fire made of twigs and old pine bark. Your feet are blistered, your stomach's empty, but you feel calm. Fulfilled even. You stare into the flames and think about Kihei's face, that blank, surprised look as he fell. You didn't hate him, you didn't want him dead, but you also didn't hesitate. And that, maybe, is what sets you apart. You've always known that hesitation kills, that the one who strikes second might not get a chance to strike at all. This wasn't something someone taught you, it's just something you've always understood. Let's insert a light joke here before things get too dramatic. If this were an anime, you'd be the brooding protagonist with a tragic backstory and hair that somehow never needs brushing, even though it looks like a bird made a nest in it. But instead, you're just a hungry teen with splinters in your palms and a weird obsession with timing. By the time the fire dies down and the moon is high, you're already thinking about tomorrow, about the next duel, the next town, the next time someone underestimates you and regrets it a moment too late. You don't know it yet, but you've just taken your first step toward becoming Miyamoto Musashi, the man, the myth, the guy who once said, "Respect Buddha and the gods without counting on their help," which frankly is the most polite way of saying, "I got this." The road winds like a lazy snake through the foothills, its dusty path broken only by clumps of weeds and the occasional rice paddy. You walk with your bakken slung over one shoulder like it's some kind of oversized toothpick. Every step kicks up a little puff of dust behind you, footprints of a boy becoming something else entirely. You're not headed anywhere in particular, which is kind of your thing now. Vagabond, ronin, wild dog with a wooden sword. The sky is hot and cloudless. You've been walking since dawn, and your stomach has started making those deep, hollow gurgles that sound like distant thunder. Not that food is a reliable thing in your life. Some days a passing farmer might hand you a rice ball out of pity. Other days you chew on wild grass and pretend it tastes like miso soup. The trick you've discovered is to eat slowly, pretend it's gourmet. It doesn't help, but it feels fancier. You stop at a shrine for shade. It's old, weather-beaten, and leaning a bit to the left, like it's had one too many seikes. Inside, the statue of a serene-faced bodhisattva watches you with the kind of calm you can't relate to. You splash water on your face, bow once, because even you aren't bold enough to disrespect the gods, and sit with your back against the cool stone wall. The silence is thick. It feels like the world is pausing just for a moment to let you breathe. Here's your mainstream history moment. During this part of your life, You are referred to as a Musha Shugyosha, a warrior pilgrim. This wasn't uncommon in Japan at the time. Young swordsmen would travel the country in search of duels, masters, and enlightenment, sometimes all at once. It was like spiritual Uber Eats, but instead of delivery, you brought violence and vague moral lessons. The reality, though, it's lonely and exhausting. You sleep on hard earth, curled under trees, your bakken clutched to your chest like a stuffed animal. When it rains, you get soaked. When it doesn't, you get sunburned. You bathe in rivers when you can and try not to let the leeches win. You've developed a sixth sense for which villages will welcome you and which ones will throw rocks first. Spoiler, it's usually rocks. Occasionally, you meet other Ronin, wanderers like you. Sometimes they're older, with ragged beards and eyes full of smoke. Sometimes they're young and overconfident, eager to prove themselves. You trade stories, techniques, and once, a pair of sandals. But more often than not, those encounters end with crossed sticks and bloodied lips. Respect in your world is earned the hard way, through bruises and broken ribs. One evening, you arrive at a town built on stilts above a muddy river. The people there are wary. They see your sword and your wild hair and assume you're trouble. To be fair, you are, but not the kind they're thinking of. You bow politely at the gate, which surprises them. You offer to sweep the shrine steps for a bowl of soup. A monk agrees, reluctantly. You spend the night doing chores, trading labor for lodging, and silently critiquing the other monks' footwork as they walk. Here's a strange historical tidbit. There's a persistent story that during this wandering period you once fought 9 men at once and won. Supposedly, it happened outside a dojo whose master you challenged. His students all attacked you together, and you managed to beat them into the dirt without suffering a single cut. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. But let's be honest. If anyone could pull it off, it's probably you. Scholars still debate how much of this early wandering period is myth versus fact. Some suggest you may have exaggerated your victories later in life. Others argue that the records are patchy because, frankly, most towns didn't bother writing things down unless it involved taxes or land disputes. You were, for a while, just another dusty traveler with a bad attitude and a knack for violence. Your fighting style begins to change during this period. You stop relying solely on brute force. You begin to study people, the way they move, how they breathe before they strike, how they hesitate. You start to win fights before they even start, just by reading your opponent. That, more than anything, is what sets you apart. You fight like a poet, or a predator, same difference. Late one night, under a sky so full of stars it looks like rice scattered across black silk, you find yourself beside an old hermit. He's blind, or nearly, but he hears you approaching and doesn't flinch. You expect him to beg for food. Instead, he recites a poem. Something about impermanence. You sit with him for hours, not speaking, watching the wind ripple through the tall grass. He never asks your name. You never ask his. But when you leave the next morning, something about you has shifted. A new calm, maybe, or just better posture. And here's your joke quota for the section. Let's go. Joke 1. You once tried sleeping in a tree to avoid wolves. You fell out 3 hours later and landed on a raccoon. The raccoon won. Joke 2. One village asked if you were a lost monk. You said yes, just to get free rice. The monk next to you was not impressed. Joke 3. At one point you shaved your head to look more respectable. You immediately got sunburned and looked like a boiled radish for 2 weeks. So yes, wandering is hard, but it's also freedom. Every day is a test. Every night is a lesson. You're learning the land, the people, and, slowly, the deeper rhythms of life. You come to understand that silence isn't empty. It's just full of things you haven't listened to yet. By the time you're 16, you've already beaten several trained swordsmen. None of them have managed to kill you. A few have come close, though. You still remember the one who cracked your ribs with a staff. You coughed blood for a week. But you also remember the feeling when you stood back up. Not out of pride, out of pure, seething will. Your name is starting to spread. People whisper it at gates and temples. Takezo, they say, the boy who fights like a demon. You still haven't adopted the name Musashi yet. That comes later. For now, you're a half-wild wolf sniffing at the door of history. You don't know it yet, but your most famous duel is just a few years away. The one that will cement your legend. But before that, there's more wandering, more bruises, more nights under strange stars, and somewhere deep in your bones, the coal is still glowing. Hotter now, brighter, waiting for the right wind to fan it into fire. You're 17 now. Your body's leaner, wirier, less awkward in the way it moves. You no longer trip over your own feet or fumble your grip mid-swing. The boy who once practiced with chickens clucking in the background is gone. What's left is something sharper. Not just your reflexes, but your entire presence. People feel it before you speak. Some move aside, others challenge it. You welcome both. You've fought maybe a dozen duels by now, maybe more. Some you remember vividly, some you try not to. You're not keeping score, but you know this. You've never lost. That's not bravado, it's just a fact. You walk into fights knowing you'll walk out. The others? They're not always so lucky. Today's no different. You wake before the sun, as always. There's a stillness to the morning air, broken only by the crack of joints as you stretch. You slept under a shriveled pine tree wrapped in a thin, tattered robe that smells like sweat and river water. Not glamorous, but you've never needed luxury to function. You need space, you need movement, and you need opponents who know what they're doing. You're on your way to a dojo in the mountains. Another challenge, another fight. You've heard this school is serious. Disciples trained in the Ito-Ryu style. Linear, fast, devastating. You've never fought them before. You're curious. When you arrive, the head instructor doesn't look impressed. He sees a shaggy teenager with splinters in his robe and a sword made from a branch. You see a man who's used to being obeyed. That makes him dangerous. You bow. You request a duel. He scoffs. Here's your mainstream history hit. Many samurai schools in the Edo period accepted or rejected duel challenges based on social status. You, being technically of lower status and looking like a Ronin raccoon, were often dismissed at first glance. But reputation has begun to precede you. Eventually they allow the match. It happens in the inner courtyard. Sand floor, raked gravel, cherry blossoms somewhere overhead falling like tiny pink feathers. You take your stance. Your opponent, tall, tight-shouldered, face like someone constantly holding in a sneeze, takes his. The silence stretches. And then, snap. Motion. He strikes first, fast, sharp, textbook perfect. You sidestep. You feel the wind of his blade cut the air beside your neck. You twist, pivot, and bring your bakken down in a single, arcing sweep. It connects with his collarbone. You hear the crack before you see his knees buckle. He falls hard, and then, of course, he yells. This is one of the things they don't tell you about sword fights. People scream, not those clean, one-strike, fall silent duels you see in kabuki plays. Most men, when struck, especially in the ribs or collarbone or shin, yell like they're trying to frighten death away. There's a whole art to dying loudly, as you've come to notice. Here's your weird tidbit for this section. Some sword schools actually practice kiai, the shout used to focus energy or intimidate. But you've realized that most of these shouts in real fights, pure panic, which is fair. Getting hit by a wooden sword at full speed is like being struck with a steel pipe by someone who hates furniture. Your opponent writhes, others help him up. There's muttering. Someone shouts that you fought unfairly. Another disciple steps forward, sword already drawn. You sigh. Guess we're doing this again. You fight twice more before noon. 3 fights, 3 wins. You leave without fanfare. No gloating, just nods, a respectful bow to the school's founder's statue, and then back down the road with blistered feet and another bruise blossoming on your shoulder. Let's pause to reflect. Historians still debate whether you truly fought hundreds of duels, as some legends suggest. Estimates range from 60 to well over 100, depending on who you ask. What they agree on is this. Your style was brutal, efficient, and often improvised. You weren't flashy, you weren't poetic, you were direct. You used timing and distance like paint on a canvas, and your canvas was your opponent's body. You're not afraid of pain. In fact, you accept it. You don't flinch when struck. You've learned to move through pain, not around it. This is what unnerves other fighters. They expect hesitation. You give them certainty. You walk to the next village. You've got a half-eaten rice ball in one sleeve and a new splinter in your foot. A few children run ahead of you, whispering. "That's the wild one," one says. "The one with no master." That stings a little. Because deep down, you do want a master. Someone better than you, someone who can take your raw, burning style and sharpen it like a blade on stone. But so far, no one's earned your reverence. In a way, your real teacher has always been experience. Every duel shows you something. How fear smells, how hesitation looks, how arrogance moves. You file it all away, quietly, obsessively. That night, you find an abandoned farmhouse to sleep in. The roof leaks. There's a half-broken sake jug in the corner and a straw mat crawling with ants. You lie there in the dark, watching moonlight flicker through the slats in the ceiling. You think about the man you fought this morning. You wonder if his shoulder will heal right. Then you think about the one who didn't get up. The duel from 3 weeks ago. The one with the silent end. You didn't mean to kill him, but your strike was solid, centered. His feet didn't adjust. The back of his head hit the stone wall behind him. He stopped moving. Just like that. You stayed long enough to close his eyes. And here's the uncomfortable truth you've started carrying. The better you get, the more dangerous you become, even when you don't mean to be. You're no longer just a kid with a stick. You're a force now, a storm walking on 2 legs. Joke 1. You once tried to make tea with river water and ended up inventing a new form of stomach distress. The locals still call it Musashi's revenge. Joke 2. One duel ended with both you and your opponent limping away and swearing never to fight anyone with a limp again. It's always the limpers who fight dirty. Joke 3. You've started naming your bruises. The one on your thigh is Greg. Greg hurts when it rains. In the months that follow, you begin to sense a deeper shift. Not just in your body, but in your mind. You no longer fight just to win. You fight to understand. Every motion becomes a question. Every answer is a wound, a parry, a breath held too long. You start thinking about strategy, not just attack and defense, but presence, space, sound, when to walk, when to speak, when to say nothing and let your stillness speak for you. You're no longer just learning how to win duels. You're learning how to command moments. And in a strange way, the art of dying loudly has taught you how to live quietly. You begin to move more deliberately, eat more mindfully. You meditate sometimes, even if you call it napping with honor. You're becoming more than a swordsman now. You're becoming something harder to define, something people whisper about in tea houses and temples. They say you fight like a demon, but demons scream. You fight in silence. You've stopped counting now? Somewhere between duel 35 and duel 60-something. Numbers just lost their meaning. What matters more is how they felt, how your hands remembered each opponent differently. The stiff wrists of the scholar warrior from Kyoto, the twitchy stance of the mountain bandit who wore 3 swords and knew how to use none, the silence of the old monk who didn't blink once as you disarmed him and gently nudged his blade away like brushing a leaf off your sleeve. It's strange what becomes normal. You wake up under different trees, eat food with different names, wear clothes that are all basically patched versions of the same robe, and you fight. Not always to the death, not always with blades, but always to win. Word travels. You've become something of a legend among the dojos, a whispered name that makes young disciples' palms sweat during morning practice. They call you Takezo the Wild, the Demon of the West, and eventually Miyamoto Musashi, the name you choose for yourself somewhere along the journey when it's time to shed your past like a cracked sheath. Here's your solid historical fact. By your late teens and early 20s, you had already defeated some of the most respected martial artists in Japan. You didn't study under a specific school. Instead, you developed your own evolving style called Niten Ichi Ryu, the 2 heavens as one school. It emphasized using both the katana and the shorter wakizashi together, which at the time was considered unorthodox. Most warriors fought with one blade at a time. You, of course, thought, why not both? You didn't invent dual wielding, but you definitely made it fashionable. There's a story, one of many, that around this time you arrived at the Yoshioka school in Kyoto. This wasn't just any dojo. The Yoshioka were practically martial royalty, instructors to shoguns, guardians of highborn tradition. You challenged them. They sent a representative. You won. They sent another. You won again. Frustrated and desperate to protect their reputation, they arranged an ambush for the third duel. Dozens of swordsmen waited for you in the early morning haze. You showed up early. According to some sources, you arrived before the sun and struck down your main opponent before the trap could even spring. Then you fought your way through the ambush and vanished into the mist like a sword-swinging ghost. Some say you cut down 10 men. Others claim 20. You never said a word about it, which only made the stories louder. And here's a weird fringe tidbit. Some people believe you may have used psychological tactics well before modern concepts like mental warfare were formalized. You'd often arrive late to duels, intentionally to unnerve your opponents, make them sweat, make them wait. By the time you showed up, they were already exhausted by anticipation, unless, of course, you decided to arrive early instead and catch them entirely off guard. Either way, you weren't just winning fights, you were controlling time. Historians still argue about the details of the Yoshioka incident. Did you really kill their entire line of leadership? Was it just 3 brothers? Or were there dozens involved in the ambush? The records contradict each other, sometimes written decades apart. But one truth is clear. After that day, the Yoshioka school lost its prestige. And you gain the kind of infamy that makes doors open and bodies tense when you enter a room. You walk the countryside like a storm now, quiet, unpredictable, and full of restrained violence. But you're not cruel. You don't fight the weak. You don't draw your blade unless challenged. You're not a bandit, though some mistake you for one. You're just testing yourself over and over against whoever dares to stand still long enough. Let's break the tension with a few of your classic life quirks, shall we? Joke 1. You once carved a bakken out of a boat oar and beat someone with it. That's not the joke. The joke is they were carrying 2 swords. You won using a paddle. Joke 2. You never carry a pillow, ever. When someone asked why, you answered, because I never sleep long enough to need one. The guy didn't sleep at all after that. Joke 3. You started naming your scars. The one above your eyebrow? Kyoto. The one on your forearm? That one time I blocked with my elbow. You've got a whole backstory going. Might pitch it to a traveling kabuki troupe one day. Despite the chaos of your lifestyle, there's a pattern to your days now. You train in the morning, always, stretching, breathing, shadow dueling with invisible enemies beneath ancient trees. Then you walk, listening to the world. Every bird call, every breeze against your robes is part of your practice. You believe in the rhythm of things, the moment, the emptiness that must be filled with purpose. You've begun writing too, just fragments so far. Thoughts, ideas, strategies. You keep them in a folded paper pouch inside your robe, scribbled with charcoal or brush. Eventually, these musings will grow into your treatise, the Book of 5 Rings. But for now, they're like seeds you're planting in the soil of your mind. And this is when you realize you're not just trying to become the best swordsman. You're trying to become the best version of yourself. A man who understands battle, yes, but also understands stillness, beauty, precision, and timing in all things. You begin to see combat as a metaphor, a mirror. Every fight teaches you not just about others, but about you. Where you flinch, where you hesitate, where you're afraid. You start watching animals, birds especially, the way a crane stands perfectly still until it strikes. Or the cat, so relaxed in stillness, then a blur of claws and grace when provoked. You learn more from them than most people. Animals don't pretend, people do. And here's something scholars still chew over. Whether your obsession with constant dueling was truly a spiritual quest, or just unresolved trauma. Were you chasing mastery, or fleeing ghosts? Some think your intensity was penance. Others think it was prophecy. You, of course, didn't bother explaining. You were too busy sharpening your instincts. Sometimes when you sit alone at night, you hear the echoes of old fights in your head, the gasps, the cries, the sound of your bakken slamming against bone. You don't regret them, but you don't forget them either. They live in your muscles now, in your bones. You carry them like weights, not wounds. It's not about blood. It's about clarity. And in the stillness between fights, in those long, dusty stretches of road with only your footsteps for company, you begin to feel something rare, a kind of peace. Not the peacefulness of comfort or safety, but the peace of being exactly where you're supposed to be, in motion, alone, focused. One day you'll settle, write, paint, teach, but not yet. You're not done dueling. Not until there are no more doubts, not until there are no more men willing to test the edge of your will. You sleep that night under a shrine gate, listening to wind chimes tinkle on a merchant's porch nearby. You close your eyes, and instead of battlefields, you dream of water. Smooth, flowing, unstoppable, like you. The air smells like sea salt and morning fog. You squint into the horizon where the sun is only just beginning to stretch across the surface of the waves. You're standing on the shore of Ganryujima, a small island off the coast of Japan, waiting for your most legendary duel, the one people will still argue about centuries later, usually with too much sake in their hands and too little evidence on their side. Your opponent today is Sasaki Kojiro. Tall, elegant, flashy, the kind of swordsman who probably flosses with silk threads and oils his hair between swings. He's famous for his technique, tsubame gaishi, or the swallow reversal, a graceful, deadly maneuver that mimics the way a swallow flips mid-air to attack. It's fast, unpredictable. Rumor says it's claimed dozens of lives. You're not intimidated. You're intrigued. Finally, someone worthy. Let's insert your solid historical fact. This duel happened in 1612. Musashi was around 29 or 30 years old. Sasaki Kojiro was slightly older and renowned in his own right. The duel was arranged by a local lord, likely to settle tensions and, let's be honest, to entertain a few aristocrats who were tired of watching monkeys steal rice cakes in the courtyard. Now for the details, which are part history, part myth, and part your own special flavor of theater. You arrive late, hours late. Sasaki is already pacing the shore, his fancy robes fluttering, hair glistening like a raven in the sun. He's fuming, the spectators whisper. Is Musashi afraid? Is he disrespecting Kojiro? Is he napping somewhere under a tree again? But no. You're on your way, seated in a small boat, lazily drifting across the water. You've carved a wooden sword, no, an oar, from a spare piece of driftwood during the ride over. It's long, crude, and heavy. You didn't bring your steel swords, not today. Here's a strange tidbit. Some accounts claim you carved your weapon on the boat ride to deliberately make it longer than Kojiro's famous nodachi, giving you reach. Others say you did it to throw him off. Others still believe it was simply the closest thing to hand. After all, you've beaten men with sticks, paddles, and once, allegedly, a shovel. As you step off the boat, barefoot, robes loose, and hair as unkempt as a haunted raccoon, the crowd holds its breath. Sasaki sneers. He draws his gleaming blade, the Monohoshi Zao, a nodachi so long it looks more like a fishing pole than a sword. The duel begins. No greetings, no drawn-out monologue, just presence. He strikes first, fast, elegant, flashy. That famous swallow cut arcs toward your neck like poetry with an edge. You duck, pivot, and raise your oar sword. Your counter comes from above, a wide, deliberate arc. You strike him square in the skull. One hit, clean, precise, final. He collapses to the sand, and that's it. Some say he died instantly. Others say he gasped once before going still. You bow to the body, then you walk back to the boat and leave. No celebration, no gloating, no speeches, just another duel. Just another name added to the list. Let's pause here. Historians still argue over whether Sasaki Kojiro died that day. Some believe he survived and fled. Others think the whole thing was orchestrated as a political stunt. But the general consensus? You defeated him in single combat using a wooden sword you made minutes before the fight. And that, dear listener, is a very on-brand Musashi move. The duel made you famous. Not just respected, but immortalized. Poets write about it, artists paint it. Your scruffy silhouette facing off against the most stylish swordsman in Japan becomes a kind of national bedtime story. Ironically, just like this one, Joke 1, Sasaki was known for his gorgeous hair. After the duel, someone said shame about his head, but the hair was still flawless. You didn't laugh, but you did nod respectfully. Joke 2, a young fan once asked you what your secret was. You answered, don't be late, unless it really messes with your opponent. The kid stared at you like you just revealed the meaning of life. Joke 3, someone carved a statue of this duel later. You looked at it and muttered, my nose is not that big. The sculptor apologized and gave it a mustache. After the duel, your fame becomes a burden. More people want to fight you, not because they hate you, but because beating you would make them legends. You start to become more cautious. You can't walk into a tea house without someone sliding you a written challenge along with your cup. You stop staying in cities. Too loud, too crowded, too many wide-eyed boys with something to prove. You also begin to think more deeply about death. Not fearfully, but with curiosity. You've seen it from every angle now. Quick deaths, slow ones, noble exits, pitiful collapses. You start to wonder what it really means to live well if death is always watching from the edge of every duel. That's when you begin meditating more seriously. You find quiet temples, abandoned shrines, and sit until your legs go numb. You breathe, you listen, and in that silence you begin writing. Not just fighting strategies, but ways of being, thoughts on rhythm, on perception, on knowing yourself so completely that fear has nowhere left to live in you. You also begin to draw, paint, sculpt. You even take up calligraphy. You're not half bad. One noble even calls your brushwork like a tiger napping in ink. You're not sure what that means, but it sounds cool, so you keep the compliment. Eventually, people stop challenging you so often, not because they no longer want to, but because your name starts to weigh too much. It's like challenging a mountain. Possible in theory, ridiculous in practice. That doesn't mean you're done. You're just shifting, moving from the external to the internal, from blade to brush, from conquest to contemplation. But the Sasaki duel remains your turning point. It marks the end of your wanderer phase and the beginning of your legend phase. You stop being a ronin and become a riddle, a walking paradox, a man who fought over 60 duels without losing, yet sought no title, held no rank, and collected no riches. You're just a man with a wooden sword and a few opinions about posture, and yet there's something haunting about that day on the island. You never said it aloud, but Sasaki was the closest you ever came to defeat. Not because he outmatched you, but because he was complete. He had his style, his name, his myth. Beating him meant carrying it all with you, forever. And sometimes on quiet nights, when you're painting bamboo or listening to rain slide down temple tiles, you think about him, about the graceful way he moved, the cut he never got to land, the way the ocean looked when the fight was over. You never wanted to kill anyone. You just couldn't allow yourself to be less than what you were becoming. So you keep walking, keep writing, keep polishing that invisible edge inside you. And though no one says it out loud, everyone who crosses paths with you knows one thing for sure. You were late to that duel on purpose. Because you didn't just beat Sasaki, you broke him. Before the fight even began, you never really planned on being the guest of nobility. That wasn't the dream. The dream, if you even had one, was to become the greatest swordsman alive. Not to sip tea with men who wore perfumes and spent more time polishing their armor than actually fighting in it. And yet, here you are, standing at the edge of a massive stone courtyard, flanked by banners fluttering in the wind, waiting to be announced to a daimyo. Your robe is clean, well, cleanish. You've brushed most of the twigs and rice grains off it, and your hair has been tied back with a strip of cloth that smells like sandalwood, courtesy of a very confused servant. You're carrying your swords now. No more oars or tree branches, and you walk with the quiet assurance of someone who no longer needs to prove anything but still could, if pressed, dismantle an entire courtyard of guards before breakfast. Let's set the record. After the duel with Sasaki Kojiro, you became more than famous. You became a problem. A high-profile swordsman without allegiance was a threat and an opportunity, depending on the politics of the week. Daimyo began inviting you to their courts, not because they liked you, but because not having you was suddenly riskier than hosting you. You begin to understand court life quickly. It's just another duel, really. Except this time, the blades are words, and every compliment is a trap wrapped in a silk bow. Here's your solid historical fact. Around this time, you were invited to serve the Hosokawa clan in the Kumamoto domain. You were given a stipend, a residence, and the option to teach swordsmanship. Many consider this the only formal employment you ever accepted, but even then, you remained oddly aloof, half in, half out. You attended meetings, taught when asked, wrote poetry when bored, but you never really belonged, and that perhaps was the secret to your sanity. Here's a strange historical tidbit. You once sat through a 3-hour tea ceremony, nodded politely through every bow, and then fell asleep standing. Someone poked you awake with a fan, and you muttered, the tea of dreams is most enlightening." The host thought it was a Zen riddle and wrote it on a scroll. It's still hanging in a temple somewhere. In court, you begin to adopt a new strategy, strategic loitering. You linger around hallways long enough to hear whispers. You sit silently in gardens so the schemers forget you're there. You watch how men lie with their eyes, every gesture, every cough, every overly rehearsed smile. It's all just a battlefield. And you've always been good at reading a battlefield. You also develop a keen sense of how people use status like a weapon. A court official might say, but your sword is unadorned, meaning you don't belong here. You smile and reply, it's meant to cut, not sparkle. Translation, I'll still win. Let's lighten it up. Joke 1. One court artist asked to paint your portrait. You agreed, then fell asleep for 4 hours while sitting in the same pose. The result? A painting so intense people still think you're glaring at them through it. Joke 2. A noblewoman once asked what shampoo you used. You said dirt and discipline. She didn't laugh, but she also didn't ask again. Joke 3. You were once offered a silk pillow. You used it to clean your blade. Teaching became part of your routine now. Young samurai, noble sons, and occasionally a monk with a hidden temper come to learn from you. You don't teach them to fight, you teach them to see. Look at the foot, you say. The sword follows the heel. They nod, confused, and swing wildly. You correct them once, twice. After the third failure, you say nothing. You let the silence do the teaching. It works better than shouting. You begin developing your written philosophy more earnestly. Every page is a duel with yourself. You start codifying your principles, timing, rhythm, emptiness, detachment, not for others, but for clarity. You believe that a true warrior isn't just skilled. They're aware. A blade without awareness is just a sharp stick. A warrior without awareness is already dead, and scholars still debate, were you genuinely loyal to the Hosokawa clan, or were you merely observing them from the inside like a monk studying a lion through bamboo bars? Some say you respected Lord Hosokawa deeply. Others claim you stayed only until you had enough ink and paper to finish your writings. No one knows. You didn't leave a diary. You left a trail of duels and calligraphy. During your time in court, you visited castles with rooms wider than the streets you used to sleep in. You met men with titles longer than their swords, and you smiled through banquets that made you crave your old diet of wild onions and river crabs. You began to miss solitude, miss dirt, miss the quiet of a road where the only thing following you was the wind. But something else begins to shift, too. You notice age creeping into your bones. Your right shoulder doesn't roll the same. A faint tremble enters your fingers after long hours of writing. You begin to sense that your time as a wandering warrior is drawing to a close, not with a bang, but with a long, slow fade of twilight. One evening, as cherry blossoms fall around a moonlit courtyard, you sit alone with a cup of bitter tea. A young samurai approaches and asks, "Sensei, what is victory?" You don't answer right away. You watch the petals drift in the wind, landing on the surface of your tea like forgotten thoughts. Then you say, "Victory is not needing to fight." He blinks, then bows, then leaves. You sip your tea, lukewarm now, and smile. Not because you're wise, but because you finally understand what it means to stop chasing something once you've caught it. And yet, you don't retire. Not quite. Not yet. The cave is calling, but first, one last duel. with silence. It begins slowly. At first, it's just a way to pass the time between duels. A brush dipped in ink, a few quiet strokes across paper. Nothing serious, just idle movements of the wrist, like sword practice without the bruises. But then something clicks. The weight of the brush feels familiar, different from your sword, but not alien, like a younger sibling with its own set of rules. You start painting more, calligraphy, landscapes, simple figures with deep expression. You paint with the same philosophy you fight with, clarity, intention, and the absence of waste. No flourish unless it serves a purpose. No movement without meaning. You realize with a quiet smile that you've never stopped being a student. You've just changed teachers. Now the world instructs you with wind and paper. You're still living near the court, but your time is spent mostly in solitude. You rise early, not to duel, but to stretch your fingers and practice characters. You eat simply, rice, tea, sometimes pickled plums. You speak even less than usual. Words, like strikes, should be used with care. A bad one can't be taken back. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Musashi was not only a swordsman, but also a highly skilled artist. Several of his ink paintings still survive, including works in the sumae, ink wash style. He painted birds, mountains, monks. One of his most famous pieces is Kobaku Meikakuzu, an ink drawing of a shrike on a withered branch. It's quiet, spare, and devastatingly elegant, like one of his duels rendered in stillness. You keep your studio sparse. Just a mat, your brushes, a few sheets of rough paper, and a small pot of ink that stains everything it touches. You paint in silence, except for the distant sounds of a court life filtering in. Servants' footsteps, the occasional barking dog, the murmuring winds of strategy meetings you no longer attend. You're no longer interested in politics. You've realized that battles fought with words end, just as bloodily, only more slowly. Court officials now call you eccentric, reclusive, a hermit in waiting. You don't correct them. Here's a fringe tidbit. There are legends that you painted not just for meditation, but as a form of combat training. One story says you'd blindfold yourself and paint with your left hand, forcing your instincts to guide you. Another claims you use brushwork to map imaginary duels, each stroke a move, each composition a battlefield. Whether true or not, your brushwork carried the same rhythm as your blade, controlled chaos masked as calm. At some point you begin to understand the deeper reason you've taken to ink. You're learning to leave marks that don't vanish when the sword is sheathed. You've lived your life carving space through the world with force. Now you're learning how to leave impressions without cutting. It feels lighter, not better, just different, more complete. Let's sneak in a few much-needed light touches. Joke 1, you once tried to paint a self-portrait and got frustrated halfway through. Instead of finishing it, you turned it into a crow sitting on a rock. People loved it. They called it symbolic. Joke 2, a lord once asked you to paint a tiger. You painted a very fat cat. When he asked if it was finished, you said, "It's full of potential." He framed it. Joke 3, a calligraphy student asked you the meaning of one of your symbols. You shrugged and said, "I sneezed while painting." Call it fate. He nodded like you just quoted Confucius. You begin writing more seriously too. Short essays, observations. You reflect on strategy, not just battlefield tactics, but life tactics. When to step forward, when to wait, when to disappear. These notes will eventually form the Book of 5 Rings. You haven't titled it yet. You're not even sure you'll ever finish it, but the pages keep stacking up. You write about timing, rhythm, perception, void. You describe combat the same way one might describe a tea ceremony. Exact, deliberate, sacred. Here's a debated scholarly point. Some believe you never intended the Book of 5 Rings to be widely read, that it was meant only for your closest students, those who understood not just the sword, but the silence it came from. Others think you knew exactly what you were doing, planting your philosophies like seeds to outlive you. The truth is probably somewhere in between. You've always been comfortable being misunderstood. Eventually, word spreads. Musashi paints now. Some are amused, others are skeptical. A few are inspired. Samurai start requesting lessons, not in swordsmanship, but in composition. You refuse most of them. Art, like war, should be entered into sincerely. You live quietly now, just outside the bustle of the Kumamoto domain. Your home is humble. Stone, paper walls, the smell of ink and wood smoke. There are children who peek in sometimes, wide-eyed. They don't believe the man crouched over a scroll, brushing careful lines of kanji, once defeated entire dojos. You like it that way, but don't mistake your peace for weakness. You still practice. Every morning you step outside and draw your sword, just once. Smooth, silent, perfect, a reminder, not to others but to yourself. The blade is still sharp. You simply choose not to swing it. That's the lesson most warriors never learn. Just because you can doesn't mean you must. You begin seeing connections everywhere. The way the flow of ink mimics the arc of a blade. The way negative space is as important in painting as it is in battle. The way people reveal themselves not in what they say, but in what they avoid saying. One afternoon, a young scholar visits. He bows humbly and asks you, "Sensei, which is stronger, the sword or the brush?" You pause, not for effect, but because the answer deserves it. Then you say, "The hand that holds them both." And that's when you understand why you've turned to painting. Not because you've turned away from the sword, but because you've absorbed it. The warrior is still there. He just has more colors now, more lines, more silence. The court still tries to pull you in sometimes. They want your name, your legacy, your legend. You give them just enough to keep them guessing. A painting, a cryptic quote, a lesson that sounds like a riddle. And when they send messengers with gold and silk, you send back a scroll with one word on it, mu, void. Let them ponder it. You're not here to explain yourself anymore. You're here to see clearly, to act simply, to leave behind marks that heal instead of cut. Even your duels now feel distant, like stories you've been told rather than lives you've lived. You carry them in your brushstrokes, not as victories, but as layers, shadows in ink. You don't need applause, you don't need statues, you just need a brush, some quiet, and a good breeze through the trees. The rest is unnecessary. You wake one morning and know, without drama, without poetry, that it's time to leave, not the court, not the world, just the noise, the clamor of politics, the parade of visitors, the creeping fame that wraps around you like a damp robe you didn't ask for. You've tried to stay above it, outside of it, brushing it off with every stroke of your calligraphy, but now it's growing teeth. Every day brings new students, new challengers, new requests for portraits, philosophies, insights, dinner parties. Someone even asked for a lock of your hair. You shaved your head the next morning, so you leave. No procession, no farewell party, just you, your swords, your ink, and the slow rhythm of your footsteps as you walk into the hills of Western Japan. You take the long road to a place with no distractions, a place to think, a cave. You choose Reigando, a stone hollow carved into a cliff near Kumamoto. It's small, damp, smells like moss and memory, but it's quiet and it asks for nothing. Welcome to the part of your story that confuses people the most. Let's get the historical fact on the record. Musashi spent his final years living in a cave called Reigando. This was where he wrote the bulk of his famous work, the Book of Five Rings. Some say he lived there for months, others claim years. But everyone agrees this was a deliberate retreat, a withdrawal from the outside world into something more internal, more essential. People hear he lived in a cave and imagine collapse, defeat. But for you, it's the opposite. This is your final dojo. The walls are stone, the lessons are silence. You settle in quickly. There's not much to arrange. A few straw mats, a bundle of brushes, 2 blades in the corner. The cave is just large enough to stretch in, just narrow enough to feel like armor. Light filters in through a mouth-shaped opening, casting long shadows during the day and eerie silhouettes at night. You get used to the damp, the way water drips from the ceiling like a patient clock. The occasional bat doesn't bother you. They're quiet, like you. Here's a strange historical tidbit. Some say you lived in total silence for weeks at a time, not speaking even to visitors. Instead, you'd pass them short notes or simply nod. Others say you still taught swordsmanship to a few trusted students using only gesture and demonstration. One legend claims you once spent an entire day teaching a boy how to breathe. Nothing else. Just breathe. That boy later became a respected strategist. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. You write every morning now. Your brushwork grows faster, sharper, your thoughts more distilled. The Book of Five Rings begins to take shape, not as a collection of techniques, but as a way of seeing the world. You write about 5 elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and void, each one a different facet of strategy, perception, and discipline. Earth is about grounding, foundation, stance. Water is adaptability, flow, movement. Fire is intensity, tempo, attack. Wind is understanding others, learning their forms. Void is the absence of all forms, pure clarity, no mind, no fear, just presence. You don't write like a philosopher. You write like someone who's seen too much to waste time on pretense. Your sentences are short, sharp, like slashes in the page. Here's a scholarly debate that still echoes today. Was the Book of Five Rings meant only for martial artists, or was it a broader reflection on life, leadership, and mastery? Many believe it was written for one of your students, Terao Magonojo, a loyal disciple. Others think it was your way of solidifying your own mind, of putting structure to something you'd lived so deeply you barely knew how to explain it. Whatever the case, you keep writing, by firelight, by sunlight, sometimes by instinct alone. And during those long hours between ink and reflection, you sit, cross-legged, breathing. Sometimes that's the whole day. You've discovered something strange in your isolation. You're not lonely. You are lonelier in the courts, in the crowds, surrounded by voices trying to praise you into submission. Out here, the silence agrees with you. It listens. It teaches. You reflect on your old duels, not the techniques, but the faces, the eyes, the final moments. You no longer carry guilt, but you carry memory. You honor it by remembering, not to judge, just to see. Sometimes you laugh at yourself, at how seriously you once took victory, at how much time you spent trying to sharpen the outside when the real battle was inside. And now for your usual 3 light moments. Joke 1. A traveler once climbed the cliff to ask if you could write him a poem. You handed him a scroll with 1 word. No, he still framed it. Joke 2. One of your students tried to decorate the cave with flowers. You threw them out the entrance and said, "Nature doesn't need arrangements." Joke 3. A monk brought you tofu as a gift. You stared at it for 5 minutes, then asked, "Was this once a thought?" The monk cried, "You still don't know why." Back in the cave, your movements become slower, more deliberate. Every gesture is a meditation. Even sharpening your brush feels like drawing a sword. You begin to understand that mastery isn't about control. It's about surrender, letting go of form, of self, of fear. One evening you write, "Do nothing that is of no use." It strikes you so deeply that you stop writing for the rest of the day. You've stopped caring what people think of you. You don't need validation. You don't even need legacy. All you need is stillness. And from that stillness comes something rare, clarity. You know you're nearing the end. You feel it in your bones, in the slowness of your joints, in the way your breath now takes its time coming and going. But you're not afraid. You've lived fully, sharply, with awareness. You've left marks on paper, on minds, on stone. Some of your art has been taken to temples. Some of your strategies have been passed from warrior to warrior like secret scrolls. But none of that matters now. What matters is this moment, this breath, this flicker of candlelight against the walls of a cave that feels more like home than any palace ever did. You put down your brush for the night, stretch your fingers, look out at the stars through the narrow opening in the rock. The sky is the same sky you fought under, laughed under, bled under. It's not impressed by victories, it's just there, like you. Tomorrow you'll write again, or maybe not. Maybe you'll just sit and breathe. The sword is sheathed. The page is full. And for once, there's nothing left to cut. By now, you've swung a sword more times than you've blinked. Your muscles remember movements your mind has long forgotten. Your body reacts before your thoughts even finish forming. But it's not just skill, not just repetition. It's something deeper, something quieter, something that lives beneath the skin of every cut, every parry, every breath drawn just before a strike. Philosophy. You didn't set out to become a philosopher. You didn't sit cross-legged under a tree and wait for enlightenment to land on your shoulder like a sleepy bird. Number. Your wisdom came from bruises, from cracked ribs, from watching a man's eyes go wide the moment before he falls and realizing he was already defeated 5 seconds ago. This is how your ideas take shape, slowly like mist. They aren't declarations, they're discoveries. Let's start with one of your most famous lines. Perceive that which cannot be seen with the eye. You don't mean ghosts or illusions. You mean intention, the way a man breathes before he lies, the way a warrior shifts his weight half a second before drawing. You mean presence. You train yourself to notice everything, not just the obvious, especially not the obvious. You sit outside your cave most mornings now, letting the sun warm your knees, writing between stretches of silence. The ideas flow not as conclusions, but as questions you keep returning to. What is strength without control? What is discipline without clarity? What is life without purpose? Here's a mainstream historical fact. In the Book of 5 Rings, you wrote extensively about rhythm. Not just in combat, but in life. You believed rhythm was the key to mastery. In all things, you wrote, a rhythm exists. Swordsmanship, painting, leadership, even everyday conversation, it's all rhythm. Know the rhythm, control the rhythm, break the rhythm, and you win. You also warned against becoming attached to form. You wrote, there is no such thing as a fixed position. That idea alone could shake a few modern motivational speakers right off their TED Talk stages. You were teaching flexibility, not just of body, but of thought, fluidity, even in belief, because a warrior who clings to one stance dies the moment it fails. And now, for a strange tidbit, there's a lesser-known passage in your writings where you claim that the sword should be like the brush, and the brush like the sword. You suggest that when painting, one should strike the page like an attack. When fighting, one should move with the precision of a calligrapher. It sounds poetic, but you meant it literally. Harmony in action, art as violence, violence as art. As your thoughts deepen, so does your writing. You rarely edit, you rarely pause. It comes out like breath, direct and necessary. You describe fighting in terms of posture, distance, and timing, but behind every technique, there is a concept, clarity, the ability to act without delay, to be uncluttered. Let's take a moment for your lighter side. Joke 1. A monk once asked you, Sensei, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You replied, depends how hard you hit yourself. He wasn't sure if you were joking. You weren't sure either. Joke 2. A samurai begged for a life lesson. You told him, eat slowly, sleep deeply, carry a short sword for people who talk too much. He wrote it down. It's probably on a scroll somewhere. Joke 3. A child once asked if you believed in luck. You said, yes, I just don't count on it. Then you slipped on a rock and nearly fell into a river. You called it a reminder. You begin to see your whole life as a strategy, not just the duels, the walking, the watching, the refusing to settle where others begged to stay. Everything had a reason, or maybe it didn't, but you found rhythm in it. Sometimes the younger warriors who still visit you try to summarize your teachings. They want slogans, one-liners. You see the hunger in their eyes, the need to sound wise before they are wise. You tell them gently, don't repeat my words, understand them. You're not trying to be mysterious, you just know that copying is not knowing, and memorizing is not mastery. Some nights you dream of your old fights, not the blood, but the moments before. The calm, the distance, the slow inhale before movement. You realize those were the moments you lived for, not the cut, not the win. The understanding that came just before. And here's something historians still argue about. Did you ever regret a duel? Some claim there were nights you wept alone in the forest. Others say you laughed after every victory. But the truth, as always, is quieter. You remember them all. The wins, the mistakes, the times you struck too hard. The times you didn't strike at all, but regret. Number reflection, yes. Deep, constant reflection. Because every fight taught you something. And every lesson made your blade and your brush sharper. Eventually you stop distinguishing between combat and philosophy. They blend, merge. To you, fighting is thinking. Writing is fighting. Breathing is both. You've become your own paradox, a warrior who rarely fights, a teacher who rarely speaks, a swordsman who now fears the dullness of the mind more than the sharpness of steel. In your solitude, you return often to the idea of void, the final ring in your book. Void isn't emptiness, it's possibility. It's the place beyond thought, beyond form, beyond fear. It's the space where everything begins and where everything returns. You write, "The void is that which has no beginning and no end. It is the nothingness from which all things are born." You look out at the horizon and realize you've been chasing that your whole life. Not fame, not skill, not victory, but void. The space to move freely, to live without attachment, to act without hesitation, to see what others miss. And slowly, quietly, you start to understand maybe that's what mastery is. Not domination, not fearlessness, but clarity, the ability to act without distortion, to be here completely. One final image before the end of this section. You sit in your cave, the scroll of the Book of Five Rings unfurled before you. You've written all 5 chapters. Earth, water, fire, wind, void. Each with your full attention, each with your full self. You look at the brush in your hand, the ink on your fingers, the candle flickering behind you. You breathe, then you dip the brush one last time and draw a single circle. Perfect, incomplete, full of everything and nothing at once. Just like you. You didn't just swing swords and drop philosophical truth bombs. You had your quirks, some of them pretty weird, even for a reclusive cave-dwelling swordmaster with ink-stained fingers. By now, your legend is big enough to hide a few peculiar habits in its folds, but anyone who got close enough and stayed long enough would have noticed them. Let's be honest, you were kind of strange, not in a bad way, this man definitely fasted for 3 days before a duel just to see what it would feel like kind of way, and well, you did. You believed that self-denial sharpened the senses. That hunger brought clarity. You weren't trying to be theatrical. You just wanted to be fully present. No distractions, no indulgences. Before a duel, you'd sometimes isolate yourself, eating nothing, drinking only water, walking barefoot until your skin hardened like bark. You weren't looking for suffering. You were testing your limits. Here's your solid historical fact. Musashi was known for embracing severe discipline and unconventional training methods. He often fasted, avoided luxuries, and deliberately trained in extreme conditions. Some records even say he'd sleep outdoors before duels to stay in tune with discomfort, so that nothing on the battlefield could rattle him. You also believed in keeping your body lean, almost wiry. While most warriors bulked up to look imposing in armor, you kept your frame light and flexible. You rarely wore armor at all. You fought in loose robes, quick to move, hard to grab. You understood that in real combat, speed beats showmanship. But here's where things get a little eccentric. You were deeply superstitious, not in the charm-wearing, shrine-hopping way most villagers were, but in your own private rituals. You had beliefs about the timing of duels. You preferred fighting in the morning before your opponent had time to settle. You hated starting at noon, too bright, too loud. You thought dusk was a trickster's hour, too many shadows, too many illusions, and here's a fringe tidbit. Some say you believed your sword absorbed the energy of each fight, that after a particularly intense duel, you'd bury the blade for a week, letting it rest in the soil to cleanse it. Others say you whispered to your swords before a battle, not as prayer but as greeting, like seeing an old friend before going to war. Some of your beliefs were even more practical, like your distrust of comfort. You never liked soft bedding. Even in your court-sponsored residence, you slept on a straw mat placed directly on the wood floor. You believed luxury dulled the senses, that warmth and softness made the body sluggish and the mind slow. A pillow, you once said, is where warriors forget themselves. Joke 1. Once a noble sent you a silk robe. You cut it into strips and used it to tie scrolls. The noble thought it was performance art and ordered 5 more. Joke 2. You had a personal rule: never bathe the night before a duel. Why? Because death shouldn't find you pampered. You made one exception and slipped in the bath. You called it divine punishment. Joke 3. You believed drinking sake before a fight clouded judgment. One time you sniffed a cup and said, "This smells like losing." The room went silent. No one drank after that. Let's talk about nature for a moment. You were obsessed with it, not in a romantic, poem-writing way, but in a tactical, reverent way. You studied birds, clouds, water flow. You believed that to understand rhythm, you had to watch the world, not just humans. Cranes taught you stillness, foxes taught you patience. You once sat in the rain for an entire afternoon just to observe how water pooled and moved across uneven rock. Later, you'd write about using the flow of water in footwork, never resisting terrain, always adapting. You had odd beliefs about sound, too. You trained in silence, no chanting, no music. You wanted to hear everything. A twig snapping, a breath drawn, the shift of a sandal. You once reprimanded a student for sighing during practice. Even the wind listens, you said, and here's something most don't know. You didn't fully trust mirrors. You avoided them, thought they were too flattering. You believed a man's true face was the one revealed in motion, not reflection. In fact, there's no confirmed self-portrait of you. The few that exist were drawn by others, usually from memory and usually after you were long gone. But perhaps the most bizarre of your habits was your relationship with time. You never kept a clock. You didn't trust bells or sundials. Instead, you trained your internal rhythm, waking before the sun, eating by the sound of insects, judging the hour by how shadows fell across your hands. You were a walking sundial. Some say you could estimate the time within 15 minutes just by looking at cloud patterns. And when it came to duels, you often showed up late. Not by accident, but by design. You knew that time was a weapon. Arriving early made you seem desperate. Arriving on time made you predictable. But late? That made your opponents stew. It forced them to pace, to worry, to rethink. By the time you arrived, you had already won half the battle. Historians still debate whether these rituals and superstitions were genuine or performative. Some argue that you exaggerated them deliberately to keep challengers off balance. Others believe they were sincere expressions of your pursuit of absolute awareness. You, of course, never clarified, but it wasn't all intensity and ritual. You had a softer side, too, one few ever saw. You were known to stop mid-walk to admire an oddly shaped rock, or to trace a falling leaf with your eyes all the way to the ground. You had an eye for detail, a love of texture. You once described your favorite ink as thick as grief, but smooth as a lie. That's not something you say unless you spend a lot of time watching both. And despite your eccentricities, or maybe because of them, people followed you. Students, scholars, even a few lords in secret. Not because they wanted to copy you, but because you showed them something rare. That mastery wasn't about doing everything right. It was about doing everything with purpose. Every fast, every scar, every superstition. It all had a reason. Even if the reason was simply to remind yourself you were still becoming something. That's what people never understood about you. You weren't trying to be Musashi the legend. You were trying to stay Musashi the student. Even in the cave, even in the silence, even in the weird rituals and sharp edges. You never stopped learning. And you never once believed you were finished. Because to finish, to think you've arrived, is to dull the blade of your mind. And you never let that happen. You never wrote your own biography, never painted yourself into history, never sent out invitations for statues or sculpted your likeness in the town square. And yet somehow your name found its way into every corner of Japan. Passed from voice to voice, firelight to firelight, until it no longer needed ink or stone. It lived on its own, in the mouths of storytellers, in the scrolls of historians, in the fever dreams of wannabe swordsmen. Your legacy was born not in fact, but in rumor. You became a myth before you even disappeared. long before you withdrew to your cave, long before your brush replaced your blade. People were already whispering about you, like you'd ascended into folklore. The stories piled up like fallen leaves, and soon no one could tell which ones came from your footsteps, and which came from pure imagination. One rumor says you once fought an entire school of swordsmen, alone, and walked out without a scratch. Another claims you cut down 10 assassins in a dark alley with nothing but a broken flute. A third insists you could sense intent before a blade even left its scabbard, as if your mind hovered half a second ahead of time itself. Here's your solid historical fact. Many of the tales about Musashi's life do originate from historical records, but a large portion, particularly the more fantastical stories, stem from the Nitenki, a collection of oral traditions and legends compiled after your death. It mixes real duels, real places, and real people with exaggeration, hearsay, and downright fantasy. And that's what makes it powerful. That's what turns a man into a mountain. You never corrected any of it. You never bothered. And why would you? You always knew the truth was only part of the story. The rest, that belonged to the world. Some of your adventures border on absurd. According to one tale, you swam upstream in full armor to ambush a castle from the water. Another says you once knocked a man unconscious by slapping him with a fan. One bold account has you slicing a falling arrow in half mid-flight, which, while extremely cool, is also extremely unlikely, unless you were bored. Then, maybe, let's lighten the mood with a few jokes from the Myth Factory. Joke 1. One story claims you could cook rice just by staring at it until it submitted. A wandering monk tried to imitate this technique. He went hungry for 3 days. Joke 2. A local legend says you once argued with a mountain and won. The mountain has been slightly shorter ever since. Joke 3. Children were told that if they lied, Musashi would appear in their dreams and teach them calligraphy until they confessed. To this day, some still fear brush pens. But here's the thing. These stories, wild as they are, all orbit a certain truth. Even the myths that seem ridiculous carry the weight of your presence. You'd earned them not with stunts, but with discipline, with the quiet, undeniable certainty that comes from living what you teach. You weren't flashy, you weren't charming, you weren't even particularly social, but you were consistent, real, relentlessly intentional. And people feel that, even through layers of exaggeration. They know when a legend started as something solid. The rumors weren't just about your fights. Some said you could vanish at will, that you once stood motionless for so long a bird nested on your shoulder. Others believed you could speak to animals, that you once asked a crow for weather advice, and it was right. Of course, there were darker stories too, tales of you walking away from duels before the final blow, of your eyes being empty during battle, as if something else had taken over, of you showing no emotion when a young swordsman begged for mercy, not because you were cruel, but because mercy in that moment would have been worse than defeat. Historians still debate the moral quality of your actions. Were you noble or ruthless, enlightened or detached? Some portray you as a philosopher warrior, others as a war-hardened cynic who outlived his empathy. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere in the middle. You were never trying to be good or bad. You were trying to be true. You weren't concerned with morality as much as harmony, alignment between intention and action, presence and movement. You didn't judge a man by his status, but by how he held his sword, how he breathed, whether his eyes betrayed fear or discipline, and that's what unsettled people. You couldn't be placed, couldn't be filed under hero or villain. You weren't what anyone expected a swordsman to be. You were better. You didn't chase legacy, but legacy chased you, and here's a strange tidbit. After your death, many swordsmen began creating fake Musashi scrolls, little scraps of paper with half-baked quotes passed off as your teachings. It became a cottage industry. The Way of Musashi in 10 Steps. Musashi's secret training manual. None of them were yours. But you probably would have smiled at the hustle. People were trying to bottle the void. Even today, centuries later, your name carries weight. Anime, films, novels, video games, business seminars. Your strategies are taught in boardrooms. Your brushwork hangs in museums. Your duels are reenacted at festivals by actors with plastic swords and too much eyeliner. And still, no one knows exactly who you were, because the man who lived in the cave, the one who once fought with a wooden oar and refused to wear armor, that man belonged to no one. You didn't leave behind a bloodline. You didn't build a temple in your name. You didn't even keep your belongings in one place. You left behind ideas, movements, a feeling that someone like you existed. A warrior who didn't crave war. A legend who rejected glory. A man who could win every duel but still choose to live in a cave with a brush instead of a crown. Joke 1. Bonus. One village believes your ghost still wanders the forest, correcting people's footwork when they jog. You call that a stance? Joke 2. Bonus. Someone once claimed they saw your reflection in a pond. You were shaking your head. Wrong grip. So yes, your legacy's mostly rumor, but rumor has a funny way of surviving longer than stone. Because rumor lives in imagination, and you, Musashi, gave the world just enough truth to imagine the rest. You never chased immortality, but somehow you got there anyway. Fast forward a few hundred years. The world's louder now, busier. Everyone's got a pocket full of glass that lights up, and people don't duel with swords anymore. They duel with opinions, Wi-Fi, and hashtags. But guess what? You're still here, or at least a version of you is. A myth wearing a kimono, a YouTube thumbnail with glowing eyes, a quote pasted onto Instagram posts with cherry blossoms and Zen emojis underneath. The world remembers you, sort of. But let's just say the details have shifted. Now you're the patron saint of martial arts influencers, of business consultants quoting the book of 5 rings between PowerPoint slides, of motivational speakers with samurai swords on their office walls. And hey, who can blame them? You're quotable, you're cool, you're complicated, which is exactly why they keep getting you wrong. Let's start with the basics. Your name is now practically a brand. Miyamoto Musashi appears on everything from energy drinks to tactical backpacks. Someone even launched a productivity app called Musashi Mode, a timer that turns off all your notifications while you focus. You'd probably like the idea, but also think it's cheating. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Book of 5 Rings has been translated into dozens of languages and adopted far beyond martial arts. Business leaders in the 20th and 21st centuries started treating it like Sun Tzu's Art of War, a tactical guide for negotiation, leadership, and crushing your competition, which ironically is not what you were about. You didn't write a book on domination, you wrote a book on clarity. People love your intensity, your mystery, but modern interpretations often skip the parts where you spent years painting birds, or writing about stillness, or gently correcting students with a stick and a sigh. Instead, they picture you as an endless fight machine, swordsman bot 9,000. No sleep, no fear, all discipline. It's flattering in a way, but it misses the human beneath the legend. The man who once sat on a rock for 5 hours just to watch how shadows moved across moss. Now for a weird tidbit. In one modern video game, your character is portrayed as a boss battle who shoots lightning and rides a spectral horse. Cool visual, but you were never flashy. You didn't wear ornate armor. You didn't shout your moves. You won because you were quiet, intentional, boring even. That's what made you deadly. You're also used as a symbol of the lone wolf, the self-reliant warrior, the guy who needs no one. But the truth is, you did need people. You had students, friends, people you trusted, even if you didn't trust easily. You relied on silence, yes, but also on observation. You watched people, learned from them, taught them. You weren't against connection, you were just precise about it. Let's pause for your modern myth jokes. Joke 1, someone once tweeted, if Musashi had a smartphone, he'd only have one app, the Notes app, and it would be full of terrifying haikus. Probably true. Joke 2, a startup named their AI Musashi because it could adapt to user behavior. It then deleted itself when it detected inefficiency. Very on brand, someone said. Joke 3. There's an online quote attributed to you. The sword is in the heart, not the hand. You never said that, but it does sound kind of poetic. You'll let it slide. A lot of modern misreadings focus on your toughness, Your supposed stoicism, they think you were emotionless, a walking void, but you felt things. You just didn't let them lead you. There's a difference between emotionlessness and mastery over emotion. You understood anger, fear, hesitation. You felt them. You studied them. And then you made decisions anyway, because clarity isn't numbness. It's seeing clearly in spite of what you feel. That's the part people miss. They want your discipline without your doubt, your sharpness without your reflection, your victories without your solitude. But the truth is, you didn't become Musashi just by swinging a sword. You became Musashi by stopping. Stopping to breathe, stopping to ask why. Stopping to realize that winning isn't always the same as growing. Modern films get some things right, though. They show your duels with cinematic elegance. The long stare-downs, the quiet footwork, the precise one-strike endings. That part? Accurate. You believed most fights were over before they began, because most fighters lost the moment they stopped paying attention. But the movies forget the messiness, the dirt, the hunger, the times you coughed from sleeping in wet clothes, the injuries that never healed quite right, the times you were more shadow than man, walking with blisters and a cracked rib, still searching for someone better than you, just so you could learn something. They forget that you lived, fully, painfully, honestly. And then there's the misinterpretation of your way. The Musashi lifestyle has become a kind of trend. People post cold showers, long runs, no days off mantras with your name beneath them, as if your life was just a to-do list of suffering. But your way wasn't about punishment. It was about discipline in the service of clarity. You fasted to understand hunger. You trained to understand movement. You retreated to understand silence. You weren't a masochist. You were a student of everything, and that's where modern culture gets it wrong. It wants the image, the icon, the intense stare, and the perfect quote, but it rarely wants the process, the part where you failed, the part where you questioned yourself, the part where you spent an hour practicing how to hold a cup without shaking after a long duel. Because yes, that happened. You weren't superhuman. You were just relentless and humble enough to keep learning, even when there was no one left to fight. That's what made you great, not your power, but your practice. And even now, in a world with no samurai, no sword duels, no wandering ronin knocking on dojo doors, your example still teaches, not because you were perfect, but because you were intentional. Every step, every choice, every strange belief and quiet moment in a cave, they all said the same thing. Be aware, be honest, be present. That's your real legacy. And no matter how many times the world remakes you into a meme, a boss fight, a buzzword, or a motivational mug, you'll always be more than that. Because the man who chose the brush over the blade, who chose silence over applause, who chose clarity over comfort, will always cut through the noise, even if it's centuries later. You never said the word regret. Not in public, not in writing, not even scribbled in the margins of your scrolls. But if someone had asked, really asked, you might have paused, looked down, let the question sit in the air like incense smoke. Because for all your discipline, all your clarity, all your unshakable presence, you were still human. You felt things, and some of them stayed with you longer than a duel ever did. You never married, never settled, never had children. There were no little Musashis sprinting through the grass with tiny wooden swords. No home with a quiet fire and someone humming while preparing tea. That was the cost of your path, the way of the warrior, the artist, the seeker. It doesn't leave much room for roots. You had companions, of course, students, temporary allies, maybe even someone you almost loved once. But you always walked away, not because you didn't care, but because you couldn't stop moving. The road called louder than comfort ever could, and comfort was dangerous. Still, in the quiet moments between practice and painting, you'd think about them, the people you passed by, the ones who stayed when you left, the ones who offered softness and who you responded to with silence. Maybe you wondered, late at night, if you could have built something more lasting than legend. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Musashi never married and left behind no direct descendants. While he had students and patrons, he led a largely solitary life. Some scholars believe this was a deliberate choice to maintain his focus and clarity. Others think it came with consequences he never voiced. You didn't have enemies in the traditional sense, but there were men who feared you, resented you, maybe even hated you. You understand now that not all of them were wrong. You didn't always fight fair. You manipulated rhythm, delayed duels, broke expectations. You struck first. You ended fights before they became fights. You won. But not everyone called it honorable, and sometimes you remember their faces, not the ones who sneered or postured, but the ones who looked disappointed, the ones who thought they were about to become something greater, and who found only the back of your wooden sword, and a silence that followed them to the grave. That haunts you more than the blood, because even in victory you sometimes saw yourself in their eyes, a boy chasing meaning with a blade. Let's drop in a few lighter moments before we go too deep. Joke 1. You once tried keeping a pet bird in your cave. It flew away the second you opened the door. You called it a lesson in attachment. Joke 2. A wandering poet asked if you'd ever been in love. You replied with stillness. He wrote a very long, very awkward poem about it. You framed it as a joke. Joke 3. One of your students once gave you a kitten. You trained it to sit perfectly still before meals. The student called it Musashi Jr. The kitten was better at meditation than most warriors. Now let's talk about fear, not fear of death. You made peace with that a long time ago, but maybe fear of missing something, of never fully grasping the lessons hidden in your own path. You studied rhythm, void, timing. You mastered the blade, the brush, the breath. But there's a part of you, quiet, buried, that wonders if you might have missed the lessons that can't be taught by stone or steel. What it means to truly stay, to listen, to open. You think about the priest who raised you, the one who tried to teach you gentleness, the one whose ink-stained fingers trembled when you first struck down a man. You remember his silence that day. You mistook it for disappointment. Maybe it was just grief, or maybe he understood in a way you didn't what you were becoming and how much it would cost. You also think about your younger self, wild-eyed, filthy, daring grown men to fight you with sticks. You want to tell that boy to slow down, to rest, to breathe before he breaks. But that boy wouldn't listen. He was too busy chasing something invisible. Maybe you still are. Some scholars wonder if you ever truly believed in peace, if you ever wanted it. The truth is, you did. But not the kind written into treaties or whispered by officials. You wanted the kind of peace that comes after understanding, the stillness that follows mastery, the quiet that says, you don't have to chase anymore. You brushed close to that peace in your final years in the cave, with the ink, with the firelight dancing against stone walls. But even then, a part of you remained restless. That's the burden of seekers. You never stop seeking, even when you find. There's one particular regret that surfaces more often than the others. A student, young, eager, too eager. You remember his stance, strong, his grip, too tight, his eyes burning with something that looked like you at 15. He begged you for a duel. You refused, told him to wait, to train, to learn to see. He challenged you anyway. You didn't kill him. You knocked him down hard. He never came back. Years later, you heard he died in another duel. Same grip, same stance, different opponent. You wonder, what if you'd said yes earlier? What if you'd taken him on, taught him more? Could he have lived? That's the trouble with regrets. They're not the big things. They're the almosts. And while you don't let them consume you, they sit with you now and then. Like guests you didn't invite, but don't have the heart to send away. Here's a debated scholarly point. Did Musashi ever express remorse for his violence? Some say no. His writings are stoic, detached. Others point to his paintings, his quiet final years, as evidence of a man reflecting deeply on what he left behind. We'll never know for sure. You left no confession, just images, movements, silence. But maybe silence is confession. Maybe you didn't need to say, I'm sorry. Maybe the way you slowed down was enough. So, yes, you might have had regrets, But you didn't carry them like chains. You carried them like stones in your pocket, heavy enough to remember, light enough to keep walking. That's what people miss when they tell your story. They see the victories, not the questions. The duels, not the quiet afterward. The man who struck down Sasaki Kojiro, but not the man who sat beside the fire that night, staring at the embers, wondering if anyone ever really wins when they take a life. Because the longer you lived, the more you realized. True mastery has less to do with winning and more to do with awakening. And awakening often comes too late to change the past, but just in time to change you. You knew it was coming, not in a fearful, clock-watching way, but like the moment before a duel, when everything slows down, the wind stills, and even the birds stop mid-flight. You could feel it in your fingers, once strong and quick, now stiff with quiet protest. In your legs, once rivers of motion, now trembling under their own weight. In your breath, shallower now, but somehow sweeter. The end. Not a sword, not an assassin in the night, not some rival returning for revenge, just time. Gentle, persistent time. You didn't fight it. You met it like you met everything else in your life. Head on, eyes open, breathing slow. The cave became quieter. You stopped writing, not because you had nothing more to say, but because what remained couldn't be captured on paper. It was too big, or maybe too small, too precise to translate. You spent more time just sitting, listening, feeling the air shift as the seasons changed outside the cave mouth. Spring smells different than autumn. You noticed. The rains were heavier that year, the birds less restless. You still practiced when your body allowed it. A slow kata, a breath with meaning, a flick of the wrist, not to strike, but to remember. Let's pause for your final 3 light touches. Joke 1. One of your students asked, "Sensei, what's your plan for death?" You replied, "To be on time for once." You both laughed longer than you should have. Joke 2. A messenger brought word that your old rivals were dying off. You asked if they still looked better in armor. He didn't get the joke. You didn't explain it. Joke 3. Someone asked what you'd do differently if you could start over. You said, "Fewer duels, more tea." Then you looked at your empty cup and muttered, "Too late now." You knew death wasn't a failure. You'd seen it too many times, held it in your hands, danced with it in dusty dojos and on moonlit beaches. You weren't afraid of dying. You were afraid of wasting time, of failing to live with purpose. And now, with your days measured in breaths, you still had one purpose left: to let go. Your students came one by one to say goodbye. They thought you'd give them final words, a secret technique, a hidden truth. You offered them a look, a bow, a soft smile. The final lesson was silence. One of them, Terao Magonojo, stayed longer. Your most faithful, your most patient. You handed him the completed manuscript of the Book of 5 Rings. Told him only this: study it, then forget it. He nodded. He understood. You didn't need the words anymore. They were his to carry now. You laid down your swords beside you, not in reverence, not in ritual, just quietly, as if they were old friends who no longer needed to be held. You closed your eyes. You breathed. One last rhythm, one last strike, and then nothing. No noise, no pain, no regret, just void. Now the cave is still. No movement, no voice, just a memory in stone. The candles have long since burned out, but their shadows linger. On the walls, in the cracks, in the places where silence hums like a distant drum. You're not there anymore, but your breath still echoes in the rocks. Your ink still stains the parchment. Your name still floats through time like a feather on the wind, light but impossible to ignore. And now, here you are, dear listener, still, warm, resting. You followed Musashi's journey from child to master, from blade to brush, from duel to dust. You've walked the muddy paths, crossed quiet rivers, stood barefoot on the cold earth outside dojos you never knew you'd enter. You felt his solitude, his fire, his stubborn, searching soul. But now the journey has softened. The road is fading behind us, gently, like a dream sliding back into the dark. And that's okay. You don't need to hold on to every detail. You don't need to memorize his teachings. You were here. You listened. You saw him. Not the myth, but the man, and that's enough. Let your breath slow now. Let your thoughts stretch and dissolve. The blade has been sheathed. The brush is dry. The cave is quiet, and you are safe. Drift now, if you wish. Let sleep find you in the stillness between memories. You've earned it, just like he did.